Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Welcome everyone to our March book club episode. For March, we have been reading Flesh by David Szalay and inviting all of you to join us. Flesh is a propulsive and immersive novel that tells the story of Ishvan, who we meet as a 15-year-old living with his mother and then track through various moments of his life. As we move through the decades, we see the series of events that make up a life, whether that be relationships, jobs, family, but also love, loss, and pain. I absolutely love this book from the very first page, and I hope you did too. And if you're yet to read it, you can grab yourselves a copy via the link in our show notes. It's out now and published by Jonathan Cape in the UK, and will be out in April in the US. Author of Flesh, David Szalay, was born in Canada and grew up in London. He's the author of 5 other works of fiction. For his novel London in the South East, David was awarded the Betty Trask Award and Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize. For his 2016 novel, All That Man Is, he was awarded the Gordon Byrne Prize and Plimpton Prize for Fiction and was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. His 2018 novel, Turbulence, won the Edgehill Prize, and his work has now been translated into over 20 languages. Here to chat about his latest novel, Flesh, welcome, David, to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. Now, I love to start off, before we dive into your book, to ask you what you've been currently reading. So could you tell us?
Yeah, I've just read a book called The Usual Desire to Kill.
Oh.
By Camilla Barnes. It's going to be published at about the same time as my book. We're published by the same US publisher, and we met in the States to we were meeting publishers and people there. And she gave me her book, The Usual Desire to Kill, and it's great. It's a sort of, I believe I'm right in saying it's sort of semi-autobiographical, or it's about her sort of a version of her parents. And it's sort of sad and funny, and it's very good.
That sounds great. What kind of books are you normally drawn to?
I like books that are sort of realist, I guess you could say, in that, sort of fantasy and of any kind, really. I don't, isn't necessarily my thing, although there are always exceptions. So yeah, sort of books that are set in the world that I live in myself, sort of recognizably in that world. I enjoy seeing that world through books, if you like, through something that I'm reading. And so that's generally the kind of thing that I would go for or be drawn to.
Yeah, I feel the same. I try sometimes to test the waters elsewhere in other genres that aren't kind of contemporary literary fiction. And occasionally I'll get something that I'll be like, oh, okay, this has changed my mind about this genre. But I am definitely drawn to, for the same reasons, I think, is that I like reading about the world that we live in, and I like reading about relationships and people in all their kind of complexities. And I think that's why I really loved your book, because, we see so much of what makes up a life and what the human experience really is. Yes. So yeah, I loved it. But let's get into your novel. I did email you about this. I said that the opening chapter, I think I said, blew my socks off. It's such a powerful opening chapter. And I was curious whether that is the place that you start with a novel, or do you do kind of planning beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, in this case, I did write the opening chapter first. And in fact, the opening chapter was almost, you could almost say that it was sort of rescued from something else that didn't quite work. So it was like I was writing something else, and in the end, that thing as a whole didn't work, but there were some very good bits, or I thought were very good bits in it, which I wanted to sort of use somehow. And something not exactly like, but quite like the opening chapter of Flesh was one of those bits. And so I sort of worked on it. I think you could say that I worked on the opening chapter of Flesh almost as if it was initially, almost as if it was a freestanding piece of work, a freestanding story. And it could almost kind of work like that. But obviously, not obviously, but I did then want to interesting there. So I then sort of planned out the rest of the book, taking that as a starting point.
I did tell somebody that I've worked with about the opening chapter, and I did actually just tell her everything that happened in the opening chapter. So I was like, I'm really sorry if you want to read this book, but here's what happened. And she was like, sorry, that's like that's like a whole novel in itself. But it's such a great opening.
I was going to say that it is quite succinct succinct in a way, the opening
Yeah.
chapter. It's very sort of told in a very concise way. So, you probably could write a whole novel just using the sort of plot and character material in that chapter,
Yeah.
perhaps. Yeah.
There's a lot going on. Now, I am going to try and keep it spoiler free because there are obviously sometimes people that come to this podcast without having read the book beforehand. So I will tread carefully, but it is very difficult when there's so many wonderful spoilers that I could reveal, but I won't. How often does it happen where you start writing something and then kind of leave it in a drawer to return to later?
Well, I'm kind of starting to make a habit of it, actually. I didn't used to work like this exactly, but I think it's mainly because I started writing a book, probably about 6 years ago now, which I then abandoned. And I wrote really quite a lot of it. I mean, basically a whole novel's worth of material. But the thing as a whole just wasn't working. And I sort of just abandoned it and just said, I'm going to do something else. And it was obviously quite a difficult decision. There was a lot of work had gone into it. And obviously to abandon something is to acknowledge that you failed. And so it's kind of, there's a sort of morale dimension to it as well. But it was the right decision. And I immediately felt a sort of relief after deciding that. But there were, within this thing, various chunks and bits, like the first chapter of Flesh and also a few other bits and pieces, which were in themselves good. And I wanted to do something else with them or somehow use them or expand them or develop them. So actually quite a few things, like in the last few years, short stories, Flesh itself, a new book that I'm working on now, grew out of various bits of that. So that, that really, in the end, all that work kind of didn't go to waste because it's become a very fertile quarry that I've been sort of digging in for the last few years.
It's quite reassuring that the stuff that you've worked on that you then have to put to the side, it actually does end up returning to you. Because I always find it really scary, the amount of documents that I've got in my laptop that are like the start of something, but then they're just abandoned.
No. I mean, and you go back to the ones that really sort of mean something to you somehow or important to you in some way, I guess. And I mean, there are other things that I've abandoned or dropped or half written that I haven't gone back to, but the ones which sort of, that have some real, you do go back to them, I think.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you returned to this because it is such a fantastic novel. And I was speaking to somebody the other day about it, actually, and he'd started the book before me, and he's a bookseller, and he was saying, oh, like, what are you going to be reading next? And I told him this, and he was like, please message me when you've read the first, like, 3 chapters. And I was like, okay, fine. And then we've almost had like a buddy read of it because he was like,
great.
have you got to this bit yet? Have you got to this bit?
Oh, fantastic. That's nice.
It's great. It's great. But we follow your protagonist Ishvan throughout his life, as I said in my intro. And he is this incredibly kind of complex character, as we all are, I guess. But he's just such a compelling character to read. Why did you want to follow him through kind of decades of his life rather than say a smaller period than that? Was that kind of overwhelming, or did it give you more freedom?
I mean, it obviously means that you can sort of put more. I mean, the book works basically as a series of chapters, each of which covers quite a short period of time, albeit usually a very intense series of events. But then the book as a whole covers, as you say, decades of this man's life, perhaps almost 50 years in total. So I guess it's sort of working on two planes simultaneously. Like within each chapter, it's working on an almost sort of day by day, or moment by moment, or at least week by week, sort of life seen in close up. But the book as a whole presents a sort of big, wide panorama of this guy's life. And I think I was definitely it's something to do with the contrast and the interesting interaction between those two different ways of seeing experience that was important to me, I guess. I think, I did. I mean, I know that from the beginning, I did want to kind of, for the book to cover a big chunk of his life. I mean, like most of it in a way. I just felt that was sort of, in order to understand somebody's whole life, you need to sort of see it, if not literally in its entirety, then from a broad perspective. And I think kind of what experiences mean can only be understood in that kind of wide perspective. And of course, it's possible when writing something to give that wide perspective at the same time as only covering in the book a small amount of time, I guess. But I guess I also wanted to write about just the process of time passing, of experiencing time itself, which has kind of become a slight preoccupation of mine, I guess, because something quite similar was going on in an earlier book I wrote, All That Man Is, a few years ago.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing to kind of look at, and I was really interested in how you navigated looking at such a a long period of somebody's life, because you do these leaps between chapters. There's a leap in time between chapters, and it's almost kind of disorienting as a reader to find yourself, okay, we're in a different space now, and this is different, and what's happened in that time. But I don't mean that in a kind of negative sense, because for me, I really enjoyed sort of piecing together the puzzle of it, and the reveals that we have of, okay, this is how his life's changed in that period of time. Why did you want to do that?
Well, I mean, partly just because it's fun and it's something I enjoy as a reader. I mean,
Yeah.
I do like that as a reader. I mean, one writer who does this really well, the same thing you're talking about, is Alan Hollinghurst. In a lot of his novels, you get this something similar going on, and it's lots of writers do it. It's quite a common thing, but I do enjoy it where the story jumps ahead in time, and for the first few pages of the new chapter or section, you as the reader are kind of trying to figure out what's going on exactly. And so you're involved in this little game with the writer, where the writer is sort of teasing you, bluffing, sort of, lead it. It's just that aspect of it is really appealing to me as a reader. And so it's nice to do as a writer also. But I think also there's something about, if you as the reader have to sort of do that, if you have to piece it together like that, you somehow enter into the whole thing more deeply, in a more deeply imaginative way than if you're just kind of given the situation sort of straight up. So I think that it sort of means that the reader becomes somehow more invested in it if they're having to sort of participate in this little game of what's going on, and how have things changed, and who's this person now, and that kind of thing. I enjoy that as something to do as a reader and as a writer, to sort of play that little game.
It's very playful, but it makes for a very enjoyable reading experience.
Yeah.
What came to you first with this book? Was it his voice, or was it a particular scene in the book?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I mean, the starting point was the what's now the first chapter that was written before anything else, and I then wanted to write more about this character and sort of go through his future, as it were. And I guess there were a couple of sort of main things that determined what the shape that took. One was that I really wanted to write something which had a sort of English end and a Hungarian end, because those are the two places that I know very well. I've lived a long time in both of those places, and but at the same time, I've reached a point where I don't feel entirely at home in either of them either. So it's a sort of interesting situation that I find myself in, and I wanted to somehow write about someone in a similar situation somehow, or at least write a book that used that sort of my knowledge of both the places and also a sense of sort of unease and not quite fitting in either of them. So that was one thing, and obviously the book starts in the 80s. The first chapter is set in the late 80s, so that the character might be a Hungarian who emigrates to England was an obvious way to go, because obviously there was a big wave of that sort of emigration in around 2005, when Hungary and other countries joined the EU. And in fact, I have Hungarian relatives, who made that journey themselves. So that's something that I was also sort of felt I could write about and knew about and had feelings about. So there was that. And then another consideration would be, I wanted to write a book about sort of physical experience, in a way, a book about life as a physical experience, as something that you experience on a physical level. And so a lot of the sort of decisions about what happens in the sort of the plot points, the plot was sort of written with that, or imagined with that in mind. And so, yeah, then it just sort of, I guess I just in my mind had a few big events in his life. I mean, I don't know if it's too much of a spoiler to say that he becomes a soldier and has some experiences in the Iraq War of 2003, and then he emigrates to England later that decade, and and then it just sort of follows his life.
I think one of the things that I really love, just on you talking about, him becoming a soldier, is I love the way that you write about sort of masculinity and sort of male mental health. And, it has for so long been a very kind of taboo topic. And it's I don't want to make any kind of generalizations, but I know that it's much more difficult for men to kind of open up about their emotions. And we see the after effects of Ishvan's time in the army and in the war and the sort of trauma that he experiences. I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that, because anybody,
Sure. Yeah.
in the army would have that. And, we see later on in the book that he has a drinking problem. And I suppose, there's kind of a through line there with that. What drew you or was important when exploring those themes in the book?
I mean, I guess I was really just kind of trying to write about experience as honestly as I could. And coming to things like that is just, I guess, where you end up if you try and write about experience honestly. So I didn't, obviously I was aware that, there were these themes, sort of abstract ideas there, but I didn't really want to, and I tried hard not to write with a sort of agenda of that kind. I didn't want to sort of write a book about men finding it difficult to open up, or specifically, I mean, I just wanted to sort of address specific situations as honestly as I could. And that's just sort of kind of where it ended up, because men finding it difficult to open up or whatever is a real thing. That if you'll talk honestly about things, and virtually nothing in the book is autobiographical, in the sense that the actual events of Ishvan's life have not happened to me. But obviously, just being a man in our world, that we have that in common, and so that was something that was very kind of, I wanted to write about in as honest and direct a way as possible.
I really loved, there's a conversation that he has with, I can't remember if it's his doctor or his therapist, but he has a conversation about going on medication, and the doctor's kind of helping him to understand, what it is that he's going through, and he can't quite grasp it. It's sort of a like, oh no, that wouldn't happen to me, or like, no, like, and the doctor kind of explains it in this really simple way, that it's like, it's just it can sometimes just come down to it being a chemical shift in the brain, and that's the sort of difference between somebody having good mental health or poor mental health. And I don't know why that felt like such a groundbreaking thing to read, for it to be as simple as that. And it never really ever needed to be a taboo topic that it's been made into, because it can be just as simple as that. It can happen to anybody. And yeah, I just really loved that you inserted that scene. I don't really have a question about that.
I like that scene too. That was when I was writing when I was quite early on in the process of writing the book. That scene was one of the bits that kind of really made me feel that I should keep going with this book. I think that, I like it too.
It's a great scene. I do want to ask about the many different relationships throughout Ishvan's life with various women, and there's almost always an element of sort of imbalance to these relationships. I don't know if imbalance is the right word actually, but we'll go with that. Or a sort of sense that it's kind of morally questionable, or it shouldn't be happening. Why do you think Ishvan is drawn to these relationships?
Well, I mean, I guess, again, without wanting to sort of spoil it, the first chapter, sort of, which takes place when he's an adolescent, I suppose one answer to that question would be that we're all very formed by what happens to us at that age, and the sort of the pattern of his future relationships is to some extent set by that early relationship or early experience, because some of the other major, there are several kind of significant, not that many, but a few significant relationships with women that he has in the book that sort of almost sort of structure his life in a way. But they do follow that same pattern. And I mean, in a way, to some extent, that's a generalization, which, you could pick holes in, but there are similarities. And again, though, I didn't sort of have a specific agenda when I was writing it. I didn't really want, there was nothing sort of, no specific point I wanted to make about relationships. It was more, again, just sort of using the plot that I had developed to just sort of address each episode of it as honestly as I possibly could. And if as you say, quite a lot of the situations in which he finds himself do feel a bit uncomfortable, transgressive in some way, there is often this sort of sense that, there's something not entirely right, I guess. I mean, and that's a bit of a silly way of putting it. And yeah, it was maybe because I was trying to, I did want to sort of be very honest, and maybe in a desire to sort of be very honest, I almost, push things to a point where, how can I? It was almost like I wanted to get to an uncomfortable place in order to sort of prove that I was being honest or something. It's a sort of
this is great. I think sometimes, and I think it's shown through the relationships in his life, there are things that are kind of like, almost like a domino effect. So, he has these formative experiences with a woman, and then that might lead to a choice that he makes in the future or a particular desire that he has. And I just think that's so interesting to read, because you do see that in real life, and you do see, I've certainly had experiences that have maybe led to me making a certain choice. And I think it's just, those moments that we never really kind of consider as we go about our day-to-day life, but actually when you're reading it, you're like, that's actually really interesting to read.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
So
there was definitely a sense that I wanted to get across, that his decisions, often what seems to be a decision is sort of really influenced by something that's almost not exactly hidden, but a lot of people have described him as a passive character, which I'm not sure I quite agree with.
no.
I think what they're trying to get at is that there's a feeling that sort of his life, something which might be called fate, or just kind of events beyond his control, shape his life in all kinds of ways. And I think that's true of all of us, though. I mean, I don't think anybody's life is not like that to quite a large extent. So
absolutely. And I think one of the other things that was interesting in later relationships is this sort of exploration of wealth and class. And that's not just specific to relationships, that's just specific to, I mean, the UK class system is its own issue. But we're obviously looking at wealth and class and the intersection of these things, but through Ishran's lens as an immigrant. And, an immigrant living in the UK. Could you tell us about how wealth and class are these things that sort of continue to spring up in his life?
Well, yeah, I mean, I did. It was one thing which was kind of interesting was to write about the UK, England, London, which is where most of the action takes place, through the eyes of an outsider. So, that sort of means you can write about things which might be very familiar to you, so that you hardly notice them, and to most of your readers from place. But through the eyes of an outsider, you can really see, things can be made to look fresh, or at least, striking, things that you wouldn't notice normally. So he arrives as part of this sort of large influx of people from Central and Eastern Europe that took place. And they just sort of certain sort of occupations and professions in England, and in fact in much of sort of Northwest Europe, suddenly became the preserve, or very much associated with people from Central and Eastern Europe. And it's quite a major phenomenon. It's a sort of major, almost historical thing. I mean, it's a very big thing involving millions and millions of people, and sort of changing societies, not in some massive dramatic way, but in a noticeable way. So, I mean, really, I wanted to partly to write about that the sort of class aspect is more about a sort of modern contemporary class structure than a sort of old British class structure involving sort of aristocrats and stuff. It's not really, it's not that particularly. It's more a kind of new sort of class structure involving very rich people whose lives are very international, whose wealth comes from probably companies rather than whatever landed estates. Or so I wanted to write very specifically about this this contemporary social structure or social phenomenon. So it was just, again, Ishram was a very interesting vehicle to address that, because of the way that he sort of arrives in this world, which is very alien to him at first, and sort of feels his way in it.
I think you've got a real talent of exploring quite big themes. It's probably not the best way to word it, but you've got a talent of exploring these big themes, but doing it with but doing it with this great humor. And there's a scene in the book that I'm thinking of, and I hope you don't mind me mentioning it, but they're at an art exhibition, I think it is, or a gallery opening, something like that. And he's kind of stood with these people, these very important people who I don't know what the titles are, but they're important. You get the sense they're important. And one of them is moaning about, like, we need to sort out this kind of immigrant issue in the UK, or like something along those lines. And then she kind of quickly backtracks as soon as she realizes that actually Ishran is an immigrant, and she kind of goes into panic mode and is like, oh no, I don't mean you, and you see that so often in the UK, especially around the time of like Brexit. These like all these xenophobic people would suddenly come out and then crawl back into their shells once they realised that actually they were among people that they were, slagging off or speaking about.
But I think that phenomenon is, it's also also because often, people are prejudiced against abstractions. More often, than so it's not. Yeah. I mean, I know the scene that you were talking about. Yeah, and obviously it's supposed to be sort of funny, and but the character is sort of the sort of character who talks about immigrants being a problem and stuff, and then suddenly gets all embarrassed when she realizes that he is in fact one in himself. Yeah, it's kind of like her embarrassment is more to do with the fact that once it becomes about an actual other human being who you're sitting next to at dinner or kind of sort of having a drink and chatting with, then it all becomes very sort of real. But then it's hard to dislike that person because it's just some person who you're sort of talking. You know what I mean? It's much easier to dislike abstractions than people. I guess.
Yeah. Can you speak to can you become maybe Prime Minister and have this conversation with the whole of the UK? That would be great.
No, I'll see what I can do.
I wish more people could think like that. It's very frustrating to see the sort of xenophobia that's kind of come out specifically in recent years, and it's probably always existed, but it's just become kind of a bit more insidious and not a fan.
No. Well, I mean, of course that it does come up in the book, and that was another aspect of this character's experience that I wanted to look at. But obviously part of what I was writing about with this character was the experience of being an immigrant in a sort of an economic immigrant, a sort of low status economic immigrant. And that's obviously part of his story. But at the same time, I didn't want the book to sort of become about that. I didn't really want to sort of write a book that was sort of all about that specifically. It's just part of his whole experience, and obviously it has to be. It's there because it is part of his experience, and of course that's important and it's valid. But it's not. The book is about whatever. I don't think the book isn't really about. Almost, I didn't. I mean, of course, I did think of him as an immigrant when I was writing the book because of scenes like that, but. In most of the book, in most of the scenes and sections of the book, the fact that he's an immigrant isn't right front and center. I mean, I don't think.
One of the things that is just come to mind as well about him living in Hungary and then moving to the UK that I found very amusing is how we look at food. And, you mentioned these like delicious sounding Hungarian recipes, but then he comes and he seems to enjoy having like a full English breakfast.
Yeah, sure. Everyone likes a full English breakfast, I think.
Do they? Because
I do.
Well, I do, but no, my partner said to me that there's a streamer that he watches who had recently been to the UK and reviews food, and he tried this full English breakfast and was like completely tearing it apart and saying how disgusting it was. So I'm always interested in like what other people's perspectives of English food actually is. But Ishran seems to enjoy it.
Ishran enjoys his full English. I'm pretty sure of that.
At the worst times in his life as well, he's having a really like horrible time and he's still sat eating his full English breakfast. I loved it. Now I want to ask about another period in the book that you write about, which is an interesting one for me because I know some writers like to avoid it, and it's lockdown and obviously the time of COVID, and it's not like it's a great big feature in the book, but you do explore it and sort of how we navigated that time. How did you feel about including that in the book?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I wondered whether, I was writing the book in the immediate aftermath of COVID.
Right.
So it was right there, and things always seem more important when they've just happened,
Yeah.
So I did sort of ask myself whether this was really a good idea because, COVID probably wouldn't seem that important in a few years. And I also think probably there was more COVID stuff in earlier drafts, and it was sort of dialed down a bit so that it's there, as you say, it's sort of in the background. I mean, it's definitely there. It's explicitly there, but it's sort of in the background. But I guess I decided that, things like the Iraq War and the Hungary joining the EU, there are other sort of major events, sort of historical events, which are there and part of his life and part of everyone's life. Everyone's life features these things, obviously, because we're living in the world and they're part of the world. So I thought, in the end, I thought it's good to have it there as just part of the sense of realism in a way, part of the sense that he's living in the same world that we are. He's living through the same period that we're living through. And it's kind of there in the background. But I mean, on the other hand, it's in a way it's very important because COVID and things happen in the book which wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for COVID.
Yeah.
Even though they don't happen as a result of COVID, if you see what I mean. I mean, I'm kind of now contorting myself to avoid kind of spoiling the plot. But anyway,
it's difficult. But I would have quite liked to have been in Ishran's position during COVID. You know,
well, he was pretty lucky. He had a good COVID compared to many people. Yeah.
He did. Now, I've asked you about the opening of the book, but I do want to ask about the ending, which I found interesting because I think we can say it's quite a sad one without giving anything away. I think that's quite a brave thing to do because I think there's often a pressure to write something hopeful or happy. Why did you want to go down that route?
I mean, I'm not sure whether you're talking about the sort of the last pages or the last chapters. Or
the last pages,
the last pages.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just how it sort of came out, I think. I just wrote it and it did go through several drafts and it was kind of expanded actually. And some things were put in, which whatever. It was even sadder in earlier drafts.
Oh God.
It's kind of it was sort of expanded a bit in ways that I think make it less sort of probably soften the blow a little bit. Although at the very end, the last page is as it was originally written, more or less, and it just sort of came out like that. My American publisher really didn't like it and wanted me to kind of make it less bleak, or I don't whatever. She wanted a sort of something, if not upbeat, then sort of not quite so. I don't know. For me, it's not exactly. Of course, it is downbeat in a way, but
it's real.
It's real, and it's also a kind of. It ends on a very interesting note for me. It's not just sort of isn't life awful. It's definitely not that. I don't think the character Ishtvan has. By the end, he has. I want to say he's learned something, but it's more than that. He's kind of become different through the experiences that he's had, and a lot of those experiences, of course, have been very painful, as probably most people's life will contain painful experiences that will really make them who they are as life goes on. And he's been marked by these, but he's changed somehow in a positive way. I feel.
Yeah.
I mean, but I hope it's also feels very real, and it's not a kind of, he hasn't kind of, that's why he hasn't really learned anything. It's not like he could tell you what he's learned, because it's much more complex and much more internal and non-verbal than that. But so for me, that is quite a big part of the ending, and so for me that makes it a much less sort of down ending than it might be if you just told somebody what happened in a sort of plot summary. But nevertheless, my American publisher did want to sort of have something a bit more up, and I did try kind of a bit, but I just think it came out really well. It was one of those things where I just kind of, that's almost, the last page is almost as it was written just when I typed it for the first time. It just sort of, sometimes that happens. It just kind of comes out really nicely and kind of just unimprovably, I think. That really sounds like I'm bragging, but
not at all.
That last page or two, just really, the first draft of it was really nice, and in the end I decided I didn't want to sort of mess with that.
Yeah, I think it is, like you said, it's very real, and our life ebbs and flows, and we have ups and downs, and not everybody has a happy ending, as bleak as that might be. I think if you're writing, you're wanting to base characters on real people in a real life, and what that looks like, then you can't always have a happy and hopeful, here's it all tied up in a neat little bow and it's done with. It's not. That's not life.
They say that happy ending is always, it depends on where you kind of stop, where you stop the story.
Yeah.
You could have stopped the story in his life at certain points, which would have given him a happy ending.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, if you just let it run on to the end, then it can almost come. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
All lives, if you kind of just watch them all the way through, but I think his life, even that's why I'm sort of stressing a sort of something that some change in him, that he has undergone some positive change, even if it's quite difficult for me to put my finger on what that is.
Yeah.
I almost don't want to, because any kind of attempt I make to say what that is will just sound cheesy and fake and like not real. Whereas I hope in the book I've achieved something like that which feels real. I hope so.
I think you did, for sure. I loved that character, and I loved, reading his journey, and I very much love this book.
Thank you.
Now, before I ask for the finishing recommendation, I do want to ask you, because when I posted that I was reading this book on Instagram, I had an author message me to say that, one, they were jealous that I had an advance copy, and two, that your work had directly inspired their second novel. I'm not trying to embarrass you, I promise, but I thought it's nice for you to know that.
That's very nice. Thank you. It's very nice to know that. I mean, I great. Thanks.
But I wanted to ask, off the back of that, what are the writers or books that have inspired you in your work?
I always find that really hard to answer.
Sorry.
That's a question I do always struggle with, because it sort of, whatever I say to that question, I feel I should have said something different an hour later. I can never kind of answer that question in a way that really feels like it doesn't sort of quite badly misrepresent the reality somehow. I don't know. It's tricky. I guess there were just too many influences. So I'm not going to answer.
That's fair enough. I respect that. Well, I'm hoping that you will want to answer my final question, which is what I always finish on, and that is asking for a recommendation. This can be anything. It could be books, TV, film, sort of anything goes.
Sure. I mean, as it happens, there is a book that I read recently, which I did think was great, and I can very happily recommend. It's called The Party by Tessa Hadley.
Yes. Is that quite a small book?
It's a sort of novella, and I love kind of novellas, and also a novella can sort of be almost perfect in the way that a full-length novel can't somehow. I mean, a novella can sort of really approach perfection, and this is one of those just beautiful, almost perfect little novellas, about 100 pages. It's set in the 1950s, I think. I mean, it never explicitly says, but from kind of the context, it must be the 1950s, and it's obviously, it's a novella. It's a very small story, but it's absolutely beautifully written, and I loved it. The Party, Tessa Hadley.
I'm going to have to grab myself a copy of that. It sounds excellent.
Do.
Thank you so much for that recommendation, and thank you so much, David, for joining me today. I've absolutely loved chatting to you, and I really, really loved Flesh, so thank you.
Thank you, Hannah.
And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. I don't believe, David, you are on social media, are you?
No, not really. I mean, I have a sort of Facebook page, gets updated like once every few months.
Well, I'll include that anyway. But regardless, you can find David through his books, which I will link in the show notes. So go buy those and go read them. And thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.